This episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by our NordVPN affiliate link. Nord is the industry leader in providing military-grade internet privacy by directing your internet traffic through a secure and encrypted VPN tunnel. To secure 72% off a 2-year subscription to NordVPN today, follow our affiliate link in the show notes page or navigate to libertyweekly.net/Nord. That's libertyweekly.net/NORD.
Perhaps psychopathy is becoming something of a political meme. And I say this because not only that link that was sent to me, but also a number of things that I've either seen or been sent recently seem to suggest that the idea of psychopathy at political or corporate levels is becoming more and more something that people are interested in talking about and interested in exploring into. So what could possibly account for people who would be willing to subject the world economy to, well, basically total Armageddon just in order to further themselves and their own family for a little bit longer? Well, that's when we start entering the world of corporate psychopathy. And again, as I say, this is becoming something that's more and more talked about. So let's take a look at an example of what I'm talking about when I say that it's becoming a meme by looking at no less than the Toronto Star, a rather mainstream Canadian publication at thestar.com. And on November 23rd of this year, they ran an article entitled "Weeding Out Corporate Psychopaths." And I'll just read the opening of this article. Quote, "Given the state of the global economy, it might not surprise you to learn that psychopaths may be controlling the world. Not violent criminals, but corporate psychopaths who nonetheless have a genetically inherited biochemical condition that prevents them from feeling normal human empathy. Scientific research is revealing that 21st century financial institutions with a high rate of turnover and expanding global power have become highly attractive to psychopathic individuals to enrich themselves at the expense of others and the companies they work for. A peer-reviewed theoretical paper titled "The Corporate Psychopaths Theory of the Global Financial Crisis" details how highly placed psychopaths in the banking sector may have nearly brought down the world economy through their own inherent inability to care about the consequences of their actions. The author of this paper, Clive Boddy, previously of Nottingham Trent University, believes this theory would go a long way to explain how senior managers acted in ways that were disastrous for the institutions they worked for, the investors they represented, and the global economy at large. If true, this also means the astronomically expensive public bailouts will not solve the problem, since many of the morally impaired individuals who caused this mess likely remain in positions of power. Worse, they may be the same people advising governments on how to resolve the crisis.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, Patrick McFarlane, appearing as always with the co-host, Jerry McCullum.
Thank you, Pat.
Okay, Jerry, so today we're going to be returning to our Thoughtcrime Thursdays series, which is one of the premier programs that we have here on the Liberty Weekly podcast. And in our Thoughtcrime Thursdays series, we use dystopian fiction to critique things within our current world paradigm that seem a little dystopian. And with that being said, I'm going to hand the reins over to the co-host, Jerry McCullum, to introduce today's topic.
So today we're going to be talking about American Psycho, and we're going to be relating it to the Pathocracy, which, in case you don't know, is the idea that the highest echelons of politics and business within the world are held by psychopaths and sociopaths.
So this idea of the political pathocracy is something that has recently been brought to our attention by the Corbett Report. And this idea is not a new idea. It's been around for quite some time. But as he notes in his most recent Corbett Report Extras episode, that this idea has become more and more popular in the last decade or so. And I think specifically that coming at this from a voluntarist standpoint, I think that we are especially receptive to the idea that government and big business are controlled, in fact, by psychopathic individuals. And the reason why I would say that voluntarists would be specifically receptive to this idea is because we know that definitionally, government is that entity which maintains a legal monopoly on the use of force or violence within a given territorial geographical area, and wielding the reins of power and violence in a specific geographical area takes a certain type of person. Now that we've introduced our topic here today, I wanted to quickly outline our roadmap for what we have planned here for the episode. So first, we're going to have a cursory discussion of the idea of political pathology and introduce one of the main psychiatric works behind this theory, which is entitled Political Ponerology. And so we'll get into that. We'll explain the clandestine history, and very interestingly so, clandestine history behind this specific work. And in the second half of the program, we're going to be getting into American Psycho, which is a very well-known work of fiction that was written originally by Bret Easton Ellis, but adapted into a very popular film starring Christian Bale. Since that has a lot of recognition with the audience and in pop culture in general, we thought that it would help the audience to digest this theory. And another reason why I wanted to tackle a film specifically is because this Sunday, our appearance on the Actual Anarchy Podcast will be released, where we join the Actual Anarchy boys and discuss Star Wars Rogue One, which we had a lot of fun doing, and we hope that you will go and check that out. So to start with the idea of the pathocracy, we wanted to define the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath.
Yeah, so both are pathologies that show a lack of empathy and a general antisocial behavior and a lack of understanding social cues and social boundaries. But besides that, there's a lot of other differences. For example, psychopaths tend to be very calculated, and they're people who take calculated risks. They're not spontaneous, and they're very deliberate in their actions, while on the other hand, a sociopath will be someone who is impulsive, will not plan out their actions, and so they'll be much more overt than someone who's a psychopath. A very rudimentary way to look at it is to think of a psychopath as like a politician or like an evil mastermind in a Bond film, and a sociopath would be someone like a school shooter, that sort of thing. The two stereotypes of those would be a good way to split them. But additionally, sociopaths, evidence suggests that their sociopathy is created at a young age, and it's something that's created by someone's environment when they're a child, while psychopathy is something that is likely genetic and is inherent to you when you're born.
And so in the beginning of the program, we alluded to one of the foundational books behind this theory, and the book is entitled Political Ponerology, a science on the nature of evil adjusted for political purposes. So I began reading this book, and this book has such an interesting backstory that seemed just so bizarre and right out of like some kind of spy thriller that I just had to bring the backstory to you guys, the audience. And there's a funny story that goes along with it. I've been going back and forth from a house in a city where my externship is, and I spend most of the week alone there because it's the house that my family had before they moved, and we just kept it when we moved. And so I've been staying there, and I started reading this book the other night, and I'm alone in this house. It's the pitch dark, and I was listening to this band called Sun, which Jerry actually showed me the other night, and it's a very creepy, atmospheric. How would you describe it?
Dissonant. It's drone metal, if any of you know what that means. So it's very slow, and some drone metal I would describe as ponderous, but this is more lurking, and there's a lot of, it's not ambient, but there's a lot of, there'll be a certain chord played for a really long time, or there'll be a lot of spooky sounds, and on certain examples, certain songs, there's just like a wave generator going in the background, just going like, whoa, 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 whoa. It generally is not considered pleasant.
So it's really creepy, and I was listening to that and I began reading this book in the middle of the night, and it's pitch dark, and I'm not used to the pitch dark because we're living in the city. I like the pitch dark. So I'm reading this, and I discovered this amazing clandestine history of the author, who was a psychiatrist in Poland and was born in the 1920s. And he lived through two authoritarian regimes, essentially, in Poland. The first was the Nazi regime, obviously. And the second was the communist Russian Soviet regime that came in and filled the void after World War II. And the super interesting history behind this book is like I said, clandestine group of psychiatrists and mental health professionals that were conducting studies into psychopathy and psychopathy's influence within government. And they were persecuted both by the Nazis and by the Soviet regime afterwards. And so the history of this book, it went through, I believe, 3 different editions before it was actually published by Red Pill Press, which I thought was a funny name for the publisher. But moreover, the book is an actual combination between political commentary and actual legitimate, solid psychiatric studies and case studies. And so the history of this book is the author, and he has a crazy Polish name that I won't even try to butcher, but it's the history of the book is the history of him avoiding the Nazis at first while he was a student in university, but afterwards the history of him working beneath the Soviet regime. And the first edition of the book he actually had to burn in his furnace minutes before the Soviet police showed up to haul him away, and he was able to escape that time. But eventually he was exiled to the United States for his work on this subject. And the story of him in Poland is super duper interesting as well, because he's working with an anonymous group of mental health professionals, and anonymous on purpose because the nature of the work was very, very despised by the regime that was in place at the time. And so they don't know each other's names, and they pass on their statistics through memorization. So nothing is written, and it's pointedly so that if one of them gets captured, they can't divulge information about who else is working on this subject. And I think specifically the level of ruthlessness with which they were pursued by the regime just goes, it's anecdotal evidence of how maybe accurate or on point this work is. And I would like to stress the fact that this is a psychiatric study. It's filled with data and actual case study information, maybe almost to its own detriment, because as a layman reading it, it's a little complex. Not overly so, but it is complex, so it's not an easy reader throughout. But this book is just crazy, and my mind was a bit blown discovering this, and Jerry noted to me before we got on a hot mic that he had never heard of this story either. And so tracing this history, the author of this book comes to the United States, and he is shunned by the psychiatric community, and he expressed in a few articles that I did for my research, which I'll link in the show notes page here, he expressed his thought that the network of communist provocateurs and communist agents had actually proliferated the American community, and so that a lot of positions were not open to him because of his work that had gone through the grapevine, and he was being shunned. So he was trying to get his work published. He couldn't get any work as a legit psychiatrist once he came to America in the 70s, I believe it was. So he ended up doing manual labor, but he was writing around to all these publishing companies when he had finally committed this work to paper. And of all people, he appeals to Zbigniew Brzezinski to get this work published. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was the Secretary of State, I believe, under Jimmy Carter. He is an insider in the quote-unquote New World Order. And as the author of this book was stating, he doesn't really know why he doesn't believe that Zbigniew Brzezinski is actually a member of the elite class. He's just an insider. And as I mentioned in episode 11, where we covered what the U.S. is doing in Afghanistan and our aid to the Mujahideen in the 1980s and our destabilization of Afghanistan and the importation of radical Muslim extremists into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets in the 1980s, Zbigniew Brzezinski was ever present, and he had a large part to do with that. And we could even link in the show notes page him speaking to certain Mujahideen groups. But the story here is that Zbigniew Brzezinski got involved at some point in the publication of this book and was in correspondence with the author of the book. And as the author notes in the article, which we'll link to, that he believes that Zbigniew Brzezinski got involved, encouraged the publication of the book, and then betrayed him and became despondent and unresponsive. And the author says that Zbigniew Brzezinski purposely stamped out the progress of the publication of this book. And that's a different story, which I'll let you explore in the show notes page here. But just to give you the cursory overview of what the story is behind this book, the incredible story behind this book, it's just fascinating. And
we really think you should check it out.
We really think that it's a worthwhile read. So I would like the audience at this point to imagine that you're me a few days ago and you're in a very, very dark room, pitch black, and you're listening to dissonant, what did you call it?
Drone metal.
And you're discovering this book. And there's a very great introduction written by the editor who ended up compiling this man's work and editing it for the purposes of this edition of the book. And specifically, the word ponerology, which was coined by the author of this book. Ponerology is traditionally the theological study of evil, derived from poneros in New Testament Greek, which implies an inborn evil with a corrupting influence. So that, if that doesn't give you chills. And so the author is talking about, at least in the beginning of the book, that the study of evil is not well understood. And specifically, throughout history, there's a lot of study of the good and focus on the good of mankind, and morals, specifically trying to derive maybe an objective morality out of the chaos that is the human civilization. But there's not much attention given to the evil in society. And the author is very clear to make a distinction between psychopathy and sociopathy, because specifically psychopathy is genetic and demonstrably so. But he also gives the picture that evil is not self-contained. Evil pervades itself throughout society. And so that you have psychopaths controlling everything and going around and affecting the world. But it's the psychopathy that produces the sociopathy. And so you have psychopaths wreaking havoc and creating sociopaths. So we can see this through a voluntarist lens, as, you know, Madeleine Albright saying that she thinks that the death of 500,000 Iraqi children is worth it in her mind for pervading the neoconservative agenda throughout the Middle East and the Project for a New American Century. And like I said, you know, as a voluntarist, this just makes so much sense, doesn't it?
Oh, yes.
And for having a work that is grounded in psychiatry is a very good resource for us to have. And given the clandestine history of this work, and given the fact that, I mean, some of these statistics, he says himself that he does not have the source material anymore, that from where these statistics came in the study that they did back in the 30s, I would assume. But he memorized it because they used it so much, and they knew that they couldn't commit anything to paper for fear of having it be destroyed, that a lot of the study is passed down through that recollection. And that just blows my mind. But I just want to refer to some of the notes that I wrote down in preparation for this episode. Some thoughts that I had specifically regarding the story of the author of this book. I thought it was interesting when in an interview, which we have linked in the show notes page, where he was talking about why he decided to study this because he was a psychiatrist, and why he decided specifically to study this instance. And a lot of it had to do with the regimes. A lot of it had to do with the fact that he had survived 2 authoritarian regimes in his life and had seen it from both the Nazi angle and the Soviet communist angle. And he was saying that it was specifically interesting, and I had noted in my notes that it was specifically interesting because us as followers of Murray Rothbard know from Anatomy of the State that when a rival state will come in, specifically a rival totalitarian state, they will overtly go after political and community leaders, and specifically intellectuals. And we know that because through Anatomy of the State, we know that the state is supported by the passive or active acceptance of the populace. And so in order to control the populace, I thought it was specifically interesting that rival states will come in, and the first to go are the political leaders, the community leaders, and the intellectuals, because the state knows that they are supported by the opinion molders, and the opinion molders are the intellectuals. In this history, the story of this work is so demonstrative of that fact. Another thought that I have is that maybe in the mainstream study of psychopathy, I don't know how much in the mainstream will go after this idea that psychopaths will implant themselves in government and big business. But I wonder if in mainstream psychology and psychiatry, if they will highlight the role of the psychopath as being a necessary role, because, and maybe in the mind of the statist, they would argue that humankind needs psychopaths in their ranks, because the psychopaths are the ones that are at the point of the spear, and in any kind of survival situation, maybe you need an apex predator that is unbound by the restrictions of human emotion.
Possibly. I know that certainly I've heard the argument, and I honestly think it's true that that sociopaths make really good surgeons, and not sociopaths, psychopaths. I've certainly heard that psychopaths make really good surgeons, and I would expect that there definitely are useful positions in society that a sociopath would be best suited to. So this is tangential, but I would think that in a voluntarist society that you would have psychopaths, and they would be able to integrate very well because they
wouldn't be in a position to produce sociopaths, if you know what.
Yeah, there wouldn't be the incentives for them they wouldn't be in a situation to create violence and hurt other people. Instead, they would be encouraged to do things that are helpful to others.
And specifically, the author of this book, and like I said, I keep referring to him as the author because I don't want to butcher his Polish name. I took German, so I can speak German, but I can't. Polish is Greek to me. But he was mentioning his struggle throughout his study of psychopathy to identify a political system that would deal with sociopaths and psychopaths. So given that psychopaths and sociopaths exist, and we don't want to give warrant to the execution of psychopaths, because obviously that would violate the NAP, but the fact that James Corbett and people within the voluntarist community are talking about pathocracy and political ponerology, I think that, voluntarism is the solution. If we're begging the question of how would a voluntarist society deal with the problem of psychopathy, well, I think the solution is voluntarism, and Corbett has talked about this too, is that, okay, if we assume that political pathocracy begs the answer of voluntarism, if we assume that the highest echelons of government and big business are in fact inundated with people that have no conscience, and as the author of this book describes them as soul suckers, literally he uses that kind of phrase, and this reeks of Alex Jones and his sensationalist language. But from a psychiatric point of view, as people within the know, within the alt media community, get the context of what Alex Jones is saying when he says that they're soul suckers and that the elites are vampires, that they're ethereal vampires, that they feed off of people's auras. But from a psychiatric point of view, the author is legitimately saying that these people only view what the world around them can bring them in terms of success and material success. So they will leech off the energy of everyone and use the materials of what's around them in order to better their own situation. So in that sense, they leech off of the productivity of others.
Using energy and soul as a metaphor for the productivity and the emotional energy of others, not an actual metaphysical thing, but a euphemism for people's care and attention for them.
Exactly. But it was an interesting thought as well, and one that I just was talking about there, where the idea that having psychopaths within your company will actually be a detriment to your company, and the fact that you have these people in certain instances that don't care about pleasing the consumer per se as much as they do about pleasing themselves. So there's this idea, and one that we'll get into in the next half very soon, of the American Psycho world, where you have the psychopath inside the big business community, and maybe the corporate structure that we know is implicated by government is that corporations wouldn't exist but for government, that related to the Fed's boom-bust cycle where you have crony corporatism running amok. Maybe it wouldn't necessarily exist but for this environment that we've created where big business can run amok and is not accountable to the consumer because of government regulation and government action. So you have this symbiotic relationship between big government, which is run by corrupt psychopaths that allow the psychopaths in big business to screw people. And that's something that we're going to be getting into in the next half of the program, after we hear a little bit about how financially we are able to bring this podcast to you today.
This episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast is brought to you by our NordVPN affiliate link. Nord is the industry leader in providing military-grade internet privacy by directing your internet traffic through a secure and encrypted VPN tunnel. To secure 72% off a 2-year subscription to NordVPN today, follow our affiliate link in the show notes page or navigate to libertyweekly.net/Nord. That's libertyweekly.net/NORD.
So prefacing our discussion of American Psycho, we have an acute example of psychopathy acting within big business. And I know usually Jerry and I kind of come at things from more of a right perspective and criticize government and the inefficiencies of big government. But here we're going to specifically talk about an instance where big business has screwed people over.
Of course, they're only able to do this because the government allowed them to.
And that's why we come from a more right perspective.
But this is a great example of showing the psychopathy in business, big business. Specifically, I'm interested in the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, or most people know it as the BP oil spill that occurred in 2010. And something that BP did with the approval of the EPA was to release an oil dispersant into the water in order to, theoretically, it was supposed to break down the oil and make the situation safer for the sea life and for people on the coasts. But a year or two later, a lot of people concluded that that absolutely was not the case, and that the oil dispersant made the oil more toxic. And what it really did was that it prevented a significant amount of the oil from coming to the surface of the ocean and made it harder for people to determine how much oil had actually been spilled. So I personally believe, this is speculative, but I believe that it was used in order to hide the amount of oil that had been spilled into the ocean, and was used instead to, in a sense, destroy evidence. You could think of it kind of like that. And I can't imagine that, I would imagine that the people at BP who made the choice to use it, at least somewhere along that chain, there are some people who understood that it wasn't actually going to be something that was helping the, instead be something that harmed it. And I would think that only a psychopath, or someone, or at least someone who is in either a psychopath or someone who had no idea what the situation was, would make the decision to soil this. And so that's an example outside of Wall Street to use. And now American Psycho is going to be dealing specifically with Wall Street.
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this by saying I love American Psycho. It's
Me too.
One of my absolute favorite films, and I've read the book. The book is also tremendous. Bret Easton Ellis is a tremendous author. And I'm not recalling the name of the story right now, but he also wrote an awesome story about a vampire in Hollywood he's a literal vampire, and he goes around to parties and is preying on people, and wrapped up in this is a type of social commentary. And Jerry's looking it up right now to see if we can find it. So when he finds it, we'll tell you the title so you can look it up for yourself, and probably link it to a PDF version of it. But Bret Easton Ellis is a great writer. He has tremendous prose, and a theme running throughout American Psycho. Obviously, Bret Easton Ellis is not a libertarian. A general theme throughout the book, which takes place in the 80s, is the stock market boom that took place in the late 80s. And maybe you could call it the peak consumerist culture that pervaded the nation during that decade. In many ways, I kind of think within my own realm that the 80s represented the peak climax of the American empire. And this is definitely debatable, and it's just me anecdotally saying this, but specifically, there's a lot of consumerism going on in the 80s, a lot of excess, a large Wall Street boom, and this is what Bret Easton Ellis is keying into in American Psycho. And if you read the book throughout, one thing that maybe even prevented me from enjoying the book as much as I enjoyed the film was that throughout there is a very meticulous description of what everyone is wearing and of the products that everyone is using and of the media that everyone is consuming, down to specific designers. And when I was reading it, I recall my wife explaining to me that she knows what she can picture it. She could picture the book way better than I could because she knew a lot of the designers that he was talking about. Whereas me, it was just, okay, whatever. There's this, cardigan made by Ralph Lauren or whatever. I don't know.
It characterizes Bateman really well.
It does, and it's a tool. But just from my perspective, it was like, okay, I can't make the connection because I don't know who these designers are. But that critique of consumerism that I noticed throughout the novel, specifically the entire idea that these products are worth nothing, or objectively, these products are worth nothing because, while they may be well crafted, a lot of the dollar material in the pricing factor is because of the name, and people are purchasing and overspending for these products just because of the name attached with them.
A name in like a sense of artificial scarcity.
And that's what I wanted to key into, was as a critique on Bret Easton Ellis and maybe a leftist critique of consumerism and quote-unquote capitalism, Wall Street capitalism, and associate it with the boom-bust cycle and the false wealth that is pervaded by the Federal Reserve with free and cheap credit distortions in the economy, was the idea that, in tuning, maybe critiquing this critique that the left has and saying that, well, this phony artificial wealth is really a reflection of the false wealth effect created by the Fed's boom-bust cycle.
Well, and I wanted to come and make this point after the fact when I was doing the editing process, because I didn't think that I belabored this point enough, that I believe that there's nothing wrong with consumerism, and in fact it's very interesting that in the field of designer clothing, the market can create such wealth out of nothing, and if that were a healthy consequence from a completely healthy economy, that would be just fine. But in this case, the Federal Reserve creates a feeling of fake wealth and pervades fake wealth, and I think that that has a large effect on culture. And so that's what I was keying into with this point, is that the Federal Reserve creates all of this false credit, which pervades itself through the economy and creates a fake feeling of prosperity, and that essentially cheap credit driven by the Fed has affected our culture and created a culture that the left identifies as consumerism, but is really an effect of the false credit pervaded by the Fed.
So an effect of this, there's a lot of themes of fakeness throughout the book. And tuning in with the psychopathy as well is the idea of a fake human being, a fake person that is just a soulless person. And in fact, the author, our Polish friend author from the first half, was saying that, or pontificating that perhaps psychopaths are human beings without a soul. And that, yes, there's physical differences between psychopaths and quote-unquote normal human beings. That from an esoteric sense, psychopaths are human beings without a soul. And so Patrick Bateman, the main character, and particularly in the film, is the scene where he is doing his morning routine and he's meticulously recounting all of the products that he uses to appear younger. And he at a certain part, he peels off his facial mask. And before he does this, he's looking at a poster of Les Mis, which was big in the 80s, but also kind of recounts that leftist narrative. But he peels off of his face mask, and it it just shows, you know, the fakeness of what he's portraying. And
he's revealing his facade,
his true self.
Yeah.
And to elaborate on that, the movie is filled with people misidentifying each other, because the critique on Wall Street is the fake genuineness and the way that psychopaths will play you, and they're charming and they are manipulative, and they will do whatever they can to manipulate, because they are coming to the table with the benefit of not being burdened by regular human emotions. And so they can go around being fake and superficially kind. And so in this instance, everyone is so focused with their wealth and their own personal appearance that they don't know who anyone is. And throughout the novel, you can see that. In fact, at the end of the book, Patrick Bateman, the main character, realizes that he can get away with all these atrocities. He can get away with murdering all these people because A, he's super wealthy, and B, no one knows who he is. No one can identify who Patrick Bateman is because they always confuse him with someone else. And at the end, even his own attorney, after he has called his attorney and confessed these murders, his attorney thinks it's a joke. The message is a joke. And his attorney, moreover, doesn't know who he is when he physically in person approaches him and says, "Did you get my message? I murdered these people." And so at the end, it's Patrick Bateman's realization that this is not an exit, is that, you know, he says, no one knows who I am. I can't. In a sense, I think he wants to be caught, doesn't he?
Yeah, that's what I would say. But he realizes that the environment that he's in, the things that he thinks should allow him to, the things that should cause his facade to break down don't work. It's the system is so perfected in that world that he can do whatever he wants, but there won't be any real consequences because of it.
And I kind of thought that the actual physical violence that he pervades in the book and the film, I thought was maybe metaphorically speaking, it stood for the violence that is, because we know the difference between, as you said at the beginning of the show, the difference between psychopaths and sociopaths, in the sense that the sociopath is maybe the more overtly, maybe like a Patrick Bateman. So maybe Patrick Bateman is more of a sociopath, where he haphazardly is going around killing these people.
At times he sure shows that behavior where he's being impulsive, and he's, you know, as the story continues and he's kind of starting to fall apart, he is becoming more impulsive and no longer as calculated. And that would be more of a sociopathic.
And he also seems in the book to be an unreliable narrator, in that he's delusional. And you see this a little bit more so in the book than the film. But there's that awesome scene where he's at the ATM, and the ATM comes across with the wording, "Feed me a stray cat." And so he picks up this kitten and he holds a gun to its head, and he looks at the ATM, and then he looks back at the kitten, and he looks at the ATM and it says, "Feed me a stray cat." He looks at the kitten and he tries to awkwardly shove it into the ATM screen. And a woman approaches to his right and says, "What do you do?" and sees the gun. And so he just turns and shoots her. It's great. A great scene. But in the book itself, there's a scene where there's this anthropomorphic park bench that follows him around the city. But I wanted to say that to make the distinction that I do not believe, and I may be wrong, I do not believe that psychopaths are delusional in that certain sense. But I could be wrong, because
they're not necessarily so. They're not, as far as I know, it's not, if you're a psychopath or a sociopath, you're not necessarily also delusional or schizophrenic, while Bateman appears to have some kind of schizophrenic sort of thing going on.
Yeah, lots of stuff going on with Patrick Bateman. But I had another very interesting story about the film personally, where we see there's a private investigator. So Patrick Bateman has killed Paul Allen, and everyone thinks that Paul Allen is still alive because they keep mistaking other people for Paul Allen because they're so shallow. And the family of Paul Allen has hired a private investigator to look into these facts. And even the private investigator is shown in the film doing a lot of things with Patrick Bateman, going out to dinner and interviewing him and asking him about Paul Allen's disappearance. But to highlight how the elites and how people in big business and government are committing these atrocities in such plain sight, and they're still getting away with it, I thought was interesting part about the film. So we have the private investigator that's rubbing shoulders with Patrick Bateman, who is the real murderer of Paul Allen. And it's just so over this private investigator's head that Patrick Bateman might actually be involved. And in the film, the private investigator is played by Willem Dafoe. And it just so happens that Willem Dafoe is from Appleton, Wisconsin. And my grandmother, in fact, babysat Willem Dafoe when he was 3 years old. And I have lunch with my grandma every Tuesday. And often we will talk about Willem Dafoe. And she didn't know him when he was an adult, but he came from a family of like 12 or 13 siblings. And his parents were at least his father was a doctor, and one of the doctors in Appleton. And I told my grandma after the fact that when Willem Dafoe was in high school, he was involved with pornography. And she was like, oh, it was funny. So there's that interesting personal connection. I just, it's interesting to see Willem Dafoe and see all of some very crazy movies he's been in, like Antichrist specifically. I don't know if you've seen that, Jerry.
I haven't.
It's one of the weirdest films I've ever seen. But I wanted to highlight the awesome prose that Bret Easton Ellis has. I'm looking at page 26 and 27 of my copy, which is straight prose. I'm showing Jerry right now. It's straight prose.
Text.
There's no paragraph breaks or anything. This entire passage is recounting Patrick Bateman's morning routine. And I'll read a passage from it. Yeah, that's let's see. The chapter starts, it's called Morning. It starts on page 24.
How many paragraphs?
One paragraph. Starts on page 24 and goes till page 29 until there's a paragraph break. And all of it is talking about what he's doing in the morning. So, and when I say that the book at times can be a little bit of a chore to read, that's what I'm talking about. But the prose itself is beautiful, and that's what Bret Easton Ellis is good at. But unless you're an English major like me, it's maybe harder to appreciate. But I'll read from the chapter Morning. In the early light of a May dawn, this is what the living room of my apartment looks like. Over the white marble and granite gas log fireplace hangs an original David Onica. It's a 6-foot by 4-foot portrait of a naked woman, mostly done in muted grays and olives, sitting on a chaise lounge watching MTV, the backdrop of a Martian landscape, a gleaming mauve desert scattered with dead gutted fish, smashed plates rising like a sunburst above the woman's yellow head, and the whole thing is framed in black aluminum steel. The painting overlooks a long white down-filled sofa and a 30-inch digital TV set from Toshiba. It's a high-contrast, highly defined model, plus it has a 4-corner video stand with a high-tech tube combination from NEC with a picture-in-picture digital effects system, plus freeze frame. The audio includes built-in MTS and a 5-watt per channel onboard amp. A Toshiba VCR sits in a glass case beneath the TV set. It's a super high-band beta unit and has built-in editing function, including a character generator with 8-page memory, a high-band record and playback, and 3-week 8-event timer. A hurricane halogen lamp is placed in each corner of the living room. Thin white Venetian blinds cover all 8 floor-to-ceiling windows. So it's such detailed, elegant prose. Before we move on, I wanted to get into the specifics where he's talking about his routine. I pour some Plaque's anti-plaque formula onto a stainless steel tumbler and swish it around my mouth for 30 seconds. Then I squeeze Rembrandt onto a faux tortoiseshell toothbrush and start brushing my teeth, too hungover to floss properly. But maybe I flossed before bed last night. And rinse with Listerine. Then I inspect my hands and use a nail brush. I take the ice pack mask off and use a deep pore cleanser lotion. Then a herb mint facial mask, which I leave on for 10 minutes while I check my toenails. Then I use the Pro Bright tooth polisher and next the Interplaque tooth polisher. This in addition to the toothbrush, which has a speed of 4,200 RPM and reverses direction 46 times per second. The larger tufts clean between teeth and massage the gums, while the short ones scrub the tooth surfaces. It's just crazy. It's made from Australian gold black brass and covered with a white enamel finish. In the shower, I use first a water-activated gel cleanser, then a honey almond body scrub, and on the face, an exfoliating gel scrub. Vidal Sassoon shampoo is especially good at getting rid of the coating of dried perspiration, salts, oils, airborne pollutants, and dirt that can weigh down hair and flatten it to the scalp, which can make you look older. So, it's just crazy. Maybe I should get into the parts where he's talking about what everyone is wearing. So there's pages and pages of this. So whenever anyone is introduced in the book, there's a long recounting of what they're wearing and like what Patrick Bateman thinks about what they're wearing and which designers produced or designed the things that they're wearing, their wardrobe. Price seems nervous and edgy, and I have no desire to ask him what's wrong. He's wearing a linen suit by Callie Milano, a cotton shirt by Ike Bahar, a silk tie by Bill Blass, and cap-toed leather lace-ups from Brooks Brothers. I'm wearing a lightweight linen suit with pleated trousers, a cotton shirt, a dotted silk tie, all by Valentino Couture, and perforated cap-toe leather shoes by Alan Edmonds. Once inside Harry's, we spot David Van Patten and Craig McDermott at a table up front. Van Patten is wearing a double-breasted wool and silk sport coat, buttonfly wool and silk trousers with inverted pleats by Mario Valentino, a cotton shirt by Gitman Brothers, a polka dot silk tie by Bill Blass, and leather shoes from Brooks Brothers. McDermott is wearing a woven linen suit with pleated trousers, a button-down cotton and linen shirt by Basile, a silk tie by Joseph Aboud, and ostrich loafers from Susan Bennis Warren Edwards. The two are hunched over the table, writing on the backs of paper napkins, a scotch and a martini placed respectively in front of them. They wave us over. Price throws his Toomey leather attaché case on an empty chair and heads towards the bar. I call out to him for a B&J on the rocks, then sit down with Van Patten and McDermott. "Hey, Bateman," Craig says in a voice that suggests this is not his first martini. "Is it proper to wear tasseled loafers with a business suit or not? Don't look at me like I'm insane." So a lot of what they talk about actually in small talk is just mindless mumbo jumbo about like what's appropriate to wear when, or who is having sex with who, or who's doing what kind of drugs. And part of the movie and part of the book as well is where Patrick Bateman is so starved to reveal his true self that he will openly tell people that he's a serial killer. And he says in the movie, he says, "I'm into murders and executions," and people will purposely mishear what he says and hear, "I'm into mergers and acquisitions," and he'll tell people he's insane and stuff, but they just don't listen because, and I think that really goes too into the idea of the elite so openly being psychopathic and so openly causing mass amounts of human misery, and the public will just ignore it. They just don't do anything about it. So those are some things that I gleaned and noticed while watching American Psycho again last night. And I read the book a couple years ago, but was able to remember those very specific details about it. It really is unlike any book I've ever read before, and I would definitely urge the audience to check it out, to read the book itself. It's available through our Amazon affiliate link in the show notes page below. And if reading is not your thing, I would definitely encourage you all to watch the movie with our themes in mind of the Pathocracy. But as we're closing up shop here, we really hope that you enjoyed this episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. We would encourage you definitely to leave us voicemail through our SpeakPipe application that you can find by going to our website at libertyweekly.net and clicking on the Leave Voicemail button on the right hand, near the right-hand scroll bar. Additionally, it's come to my attention that the show notes page on iTunes and Stitcher and Google Play Music is not hyperlinked, where you can follow everything that we link to in the show. And I'd like to let everyone know that you can easily navigate to any show by typing in the episode number after / when you enter our URL. So, for example, this episode is episode 22. You can find the show notes by navigating to libertyweekly.net /22. As always, we would encourage you to sign up for our email list, where you will receive personalized content updates from me for every episode that we release, and along with personal anecdotes about geopolitics and what's happening currently. And you will also receive free copies of our ebooks, of which we have one currently in the works. The topic is how to live freer in your daily lives, and little tips that we've realized to make our lives personally a little more free. So we're excited to share that with you guys as well. Additionally, we're still calling on the audience to leave us a star rating or a written review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. Really, we cannot stress enough how that is how we can grow the podcast and get more exposure. So we are still asking for that. And we would thank those who have already left us written reviews or ratings. And if you liked our commentary on the film, I would definitely urge everyone to check out or anticipate the release of our interview with Actual Anarchy on their show, the Actual Anarchy Podcast, of which we will also leave in the show notes page for today. So look for that on Sunday. We had a great time recording it. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of the podcast, and we hope to see you back again soon.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, Pat McFarland here. As a listener of the Liberty Weekly podcast, you have probably heard of our feature program, Thoughtcrime Thursdays. If you enjoy perusing the world of dystopian fiction, you will love the course Sci-Fi, Liberty, and Dystopia. Taught by Professor Brad Berzer, a frequent guest on The Tom Woods Show, Sci-Fi, Liberty, and Dystopia is one of the most popular courses available exclusively through Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. Correspondingly, it is also where I have been drawing inspiration for future installments of Thoughtcrime Thursdays. To gain access to this course and 18 others taught by top libertarian professors, join through our affiliate link by navigating to libertyweekly.net/Liberty Classroom, or follow the link in the show notes page.